I hate purity, hate goodness. I don't want virtue to exist anywhere. I want everyone corrupt. Hi guys, and welcome to our weekly Wednesday winter with what models we painted this week. But this week, it's time for something slightly different. We had a request a couple of weeks ago from a subscriber for a painting tutorial. This has not been the first request on one of our videos, but it is something I've resisted thus far, as it's slightly outside of my wheelhouse. I am a purposefully messy painter. I find accidents create new avenues to explore, and also an unusual miniatures painter, as I primarily, but not exclusively, paint with artist's acrylic gouache, a paint made for traditional 2D painting. There are a few reasons. As a child in my teens, I used to paint miniatures with enamels, and I also used to do oil paintings on canvas, so I'm used to using more traditional paints. When I started painting miniatures again some 14 years back, I began painting with artists' gouache paints for reasons of availability, variety, longevity, and price. But not oils, etc., as I was used to, as I wanted something cheap that would also dry quicker and whose solvents would not fill my little apartment with fumes. From this, I found gouache to be a very versatile set of paints for miniatures. But that is enough preamble. Now, on to how I use them to paint a 1/35 scale, or 54mm, samurai from the film Chushingra. This is an old kit, sculpted, correct me if I'm wrong, back in the 70s. My father actually bought this one in a flea market many years ago, but unfortunately never got around to making or painting it. When I came round to building this particular fellow, I found that some parts in the sprue were missing, and I had to get creative. I replaced the missing weapon, a mallet or kizuchi, with a 28mm scale spear, and added a severed head from an old GW zombie kit on the belt to bridge a gap that existed. He also unusually ended up with a pair of short ko wakizashi. This is instead of a katana and short sword, as is usual. I also then attached him to a 32mm round base, and you'll see that I always base my models before priming to save time later. Next came undercoating. First was black. I sprayed the base from above with black, and then the model from below with the same spray. As you can see, the top of the model does not yet have any paint on it. Once this was dry, I sprayed a white base undercoat from above, a zenithal, to effectively pre-shade it and tell me where the light will be coming from, and also inform me where the shadows are and their strength. I then tried to keep my paint layers pretty thin to try and preserve these light and dark values for later. Next is the first layer of gouache paint. It is burnt sienna, and I decided to make this the primary colour on the model. The pigment in good gouache is very fine and dense, so you don't need much, just a smidgen, and then you mix it with water. A single tube can last you years. I'm still pretty much using exactly the same paints that I bought nearly 15 years ago. As you can see, the paint is fairly translucent when watered down this much, and the underlying light values are showing through. This will serve as a template for the rest of the painting. To begin with, I'm not making any attempt at neatness. I'm just getting some paint on the model. Messy is fine and fun. In point of fact, I would say, simply paint without fear. Don't hesitate, just try. To be honest, my models tend to look awful throughout the whole painting process, in my opinion, at least until the very end. It's fine. I'm painting for the tabletop, not competition, and because I keep the paint thin, I can just keep painting and let the colours build up and resolve any issues little by little. With this first layer done, I let it dry and then chose to go with the standard brown for the ground. Again, watered down. Once this had dried, I turned to covering the remaining unpainted area, the face, hands and severed head. For this, I used an old skin colour paint from Citadel, as it's a little darker than the gouache I'll be using later. However, it does dry a little shiny, but the gouache I'll be using will cover this, and from then on it's just simply building up. Another option on a model with larger skin areas would be to start from red, watered down. This Citadel paint is a foundation paint, or so it says on the pot, but it doesn't really give good coverage in my opinion, as you can see how it dried, but it won't be a problem for the way I'm using it. Next, to contrast with the warm colours on the rest of the model, I decided to go for a cold gouache misty blue, which is almost white, to do the belt, cuffs and straps. This I kept a little less watered down, but still gave it 2 thin coats. After that, I went for a black to do his hair and eye sockets. And that's that. Anyway, the whole model at least now has some colour on it, but it has well and truly entered the ugly phase, so the real work really has to begin. One thing with regards using gouache is that it dries a little dusty and can even rub off with a determined thumbing. So, one thing you could do to lock in the layers is lacquer it. But I found that using Citadel washes, or washes from other companies, or even just Lamy Medium, if you don't want to filter a colour over the whole model, do a very similar job. Combining these 2 types of paint I found to be very effective. This works equally well for painting with weathering powders too. So, for the next step, I cover the whole model with Reichland Flesh Shade, and then allowed it to dry before moving on to the job of bringing up highlights and deepening shadows. Next came dry brushing. I initially went over all the fabric elements with burnt sienna and then a lighter but more vibrant shade of bright light red to help roughly reinforce out the raised areas for me, but more importantly, show me where I could accentuate the shadows. Next, it was time for another shade, the ubiquitous Nuln Oil, to deepen the colour in the creases of the fabric of the clothes and areas that would be more in shadow. Once this had completely dried, it was time to go back to the burnt sienna and lighten back up any ridges which the shade had darkened down and affected the overall contrast on the model. I then repeated this step with the misty blue on the white cuffs, straps and belt. Once this had dried, I then added a few watery drops of Prussian blue to begin colouring the armour peeking through on his chest. Next, I watered down some black paint to make it like a very thin ink to use to darken down some of the shadows of the Nuln Oil and add thin shadows to other creases over the model. This is so watered down that it should dry and give only a faint hint of darkness. Next, I went back to the armour with some cobalt blue, just touching some of the vertical parts before doing the horizontals with crimson. These were slightly thicker mixes of water and paint to create islands of pigment other colours could cling to. I also used a more watery mix of this crimson to add an undercolour of red to the exposed flesh as well, which I would then paint over. It was then time to go back to the light red to highlight the lightest parts of his clothes, focusing on the bits that would get the most light. This done, it was then back to the right lump flesh to pin wash a few shadows that felt a little bit too light. Next, I turned my attention to the skin and used some ash rose. This is considerably lighter than the Citadel paint I used earlier and will need toning down and blending, but it makes a nice contrast to the recessed colour. I primarily used it in the cheekbones and nose on the face. The first step in toning it down is using some sepia to draw the shadows up to it from his eye sockets, under his nose and mouth, and up to his jawline. I then also used this sepia to cover his hair to give it some colour and warmth. Next, I felt it was time to bring some white in with some dry brushing. Obviously, white is very strong and it's very important to get as much paint off your brush as possible, but also to use it as quickly as possible, as gouache tends to dry very quickly in small amounts. I began with the skin on the severed head and the hands before moving on to the clothes. As the light is coming from above, I made sure that my dry brushing strokes also did the same. I wanted to keep the application subtle, so no circular movements like you do when you want more directionless coverage, although I gave the base the once-over with the brush in this usual way. Next, out came the washes again for the skin. First, with flesh to blend the lighter and darker skin tones together, and then, whilst it was still wet, I used black to create a 5 o'clock shadow of stubble before going on to darken the shadows off the face and onto the neck. Next, I used a metallic grey for the spear tip and scabbards to the short swords. I didn't do anything fancy here, I just applied Tamiya paint and then went over it with a black wash. Next came another Tamiya paint, clear red. I heartily recommend this paint. It's great for any kind of blood and wins me over the Citadel version. It can be wonderfully gloopy, but I mixed it with some dirty water from a mug as I wanted to create some old blood trails on the severed head. For the spear tip though, I used it straight from the pot, as if the weapon had just been plunged into a hapless foe and is covered in gore. For this same reason, I also did not paint this guy's eyes, as men tend to close their eyes when plunging in a weapon, as was found when people were doing bayonet practice during the wars. Finally, I brought out the misty blue again to highlight the belt, cuffs, straps on his shoes and fingernails, before attempting a sakura, a cherry blossom pattern, on his trousers. These trousers are known as a hakama, by the way. This was simply 5 dots in a circle, with each circle equally spaced out. For a tabletop miniature, that is enough detail, I feel, although you could really go to town on the design. With the miniature effectively painted, I then turned to its base and added a few drops of wood glue, or PVA glue, before adding some tufts of grass. As the model was primarily earthy colours, I went for green to contrast with this palette. Last of all, I painted the rim of the base black because, well, I just like the look of it. The very last stage is to lacquer the model in order to seal in the paint job. This is very important when using gouache. As I mentioned earlier, the paint can rub off if it's not sealed. Now, a word of warning. Lacquering will change the way the paint looks. It'll make it look richer and deeper and cause the brighter colours to pop and the shadows to appear darker. I almost always use a matte varnish for this, and this also means I can go back and easily paint over stuff if needs be. Occasionally, I will use a satin varnish for armoured models, but I'll definitely avoid gloss like the plague. It just does not suit my preferred aesthetics, although this is simply a personal choice. Right then, just a few take-home comments. I do find gouache a fantastic paint to paint with. It's cheap, it comes in a wide variety of colours that lend themselves to mixing and blending, and there are some amazing pigments, from day glow colours to pitch black and all and sundry between. They are easy to apply, they cover well, and they're also easy to remove and start over. A single tube can potentially last you a couple of decades, and they are relatively gentle on your brushes. I'd say it's definitely worth experimenting with them, although do get good ones, it will make a difference. The better ones have better pigments. And so, this is our first painting tutorial done. I have no specific plans to do any more, as I don't really know if it is of use to anyone. Let me know. If there is an interest, I'd be happy to put out maybe one every few weeks, perhaps, as I have found the process of thinking about how I paint very interesting. Either way, thanks for watching and enjoy your hobbying.